What kind of a state is China in around 1350? It's had a hard time recently because of foreign invasion and because of plague strikes. Europe was no better off. War and disease had struck there too. China, I think, was still very near the peak of the agricultural and economic and cultural level that it had reached a couple of hundred years before in the great medieval economic revolution, in which, in so many ways, I think, China had raised itself to a level unprecedented in terms of standard of living and sophistication of economic organisation in the whole of human history up to that time. And certainly, as well as that, I think, you've got the most self-confident and the most original intellectual culture in the world, still past its best perhaps, but still with a considerable amount of vigour. I don't think anybody who looked at China around 1350 would have thought that this was a place that you had to write off. A place that had had some trouble, certainly, but that was still perfectly capable of giving of its best as it had before.
And can you explain how the isolation of China began? What happened and why?
It's possible to explain how China's cut off from interest in the world beyond the seas happened, but it's difficult to explain still really why it was made to happen. In the 15th century, China had achieved immense triumphs in penetrating the outside world, with great seaborne expeditions going away as far as Africa. But why exactly the political decision was taken in the Ming court to cut that activity off so quickly after the 1430s is still something of a mystery. It seems to have been that some of the conservative circles at court decided that this was a distraction from the primary activity of the state, which should be to support agriculture and to concentrate on the development of that as the basic activity of the Chinese population, and that all this sailing abroad and gadding about was just a waste of time. There's also something else about the Chinese government at this time. It's structured in a way which tries, with a very small government machine, to keep control of a huge country. And frankly, anything that goes out of the zone of control, anything that gets too big or too complicated for the government to keep its hands on, is a threat. And there are many other economic activities that the state at this time looks on with suspicion, such as mining, for instance. But getting on a ship and sailing well out of the reach of the officials on land was perhaps seen as the ultimately suspicious activity, possibly even suggesting that you were going to sail down the coast a bit and reappear as a pirate, for instance, something the Ming government had a great deal of trouble with. There were many pirates who were labelled by the government as Japanese pirates, but were in fact Chinese pirates, just going along the coast to plague and raid their neighbours.
And what about the trade? What was going on? And just describe the trade relationship with the West.
The state of trade with China was rather strange, because China was producing commodities that the outside world desired a great deal, like fine porcelain, a material that Westerners tried for many years to imitate until finally they found out how to make it. Silk and tea. People were prepared to sail thousands of miles to buy this stuff and to pay for it in hard cash. Well, they had to pay for it in hard cash because there wasn't anything that the Chinese wanted to buy, particularly the Chinese in South China, who were not interested, for instance, in buying nice solid English woolen cloth to keep them warm in their Cantonese weather. So there were plenty of people coming to get things from China, but China was not in the business of sailing long distances to take these things abroad. There was plenty of local trade round the Chinese coast to the islands and perhaps as far as the Malay Peninsula, but by and large the Chinese themselves were either discouraged by their government from doing long voyages, or were else simply deciding that for trading purposes it was quite sufficient to let the world come to them with silver. I would say that it was not until into the middle to later part of the 18th century that there was a chance that China could usefully have imported some economic innovation from the outside world that would have enabled it to keep up its lead over the developments in Europe, or perhaps even to get ahead of Europe again. Adam Smith, writing in the second half of the 18th century, is still saying that China is the country preeminent in the world's richest country, and the one long renowned for preeminence in agriculture. Europeans are still writing books about China in the mid-18th century, saying what a wonderful place it is and how well organized it is, how productive their agriculture is, and so on. I would not say that it was until perhaps any earlier than about 1800 that the point came where it was quite clear that Westerners were doing things that the Chinese would have done well to have taken notice of. Though whether or not having, say, a Bolton and Watt steam engine set up to pump water in some agricultural reclamation scheme rather than using more traditional Chinese water raising methods, whether that would have really enabled anyone to make more money in China, I can't say. Certainly, the first technology that the Chinese noticed as being something they wanted to import was armaments technology, which they found about the hard way. By the time we're, of course, in the middle of the 19th century, it's indubitable that there are many things that the West can do that China cannot do so well, with the huge factories that the West is developing, steam-powered and so on. There's nothing like them in China at all. But I think we must not assume too easily that the West is a place from which China had to learn anything. We tend to assume that because eventually the West became the world's most advanced industrial area, that it was from very early on. I don't think it was, certainly not in the 18th century. Again, both by land and by sea, there's a change from feeling that foreigners are people that you can deal with, that are really useful to have contact with. There comes an indifference at the least, and ultimately a hostility. It's also to do with the worry of the court at the centre of China of controlling the edges of China. If people at the edges of China are getting interested in relations with people who come from outside this great state, it's not so much the court is worried directly about the foreigners, but maybe worried about, well, will the people in Canton start to get too uppity? People in Canton have always been rather uppity so far as Beijing has seen them, still today. Will they start to manage without us? Will they pay their taxes properly? Will they start making money that we can't get our hands on? All these things are causes for worry for the court, and makes the court go in for isolation policies that maybe certainly the people who actually lived in Canton would not have particularly wanted themselves. 1350. Suppose an economist is looking down on the world in 1350. He knows there's going to be an industrial revolution somewhere, but he doesn't know where. Where's he going to make his bet? Is he going to be in Western Europe or in China? Now, both ends of the world have had some trouble with warfare, with plague and so on. They've been a bit knocked about, certainly. But my bet would certainly have been on China at that time. Why? Because you've got a huge, sophisticated empire under a fairly efficient central government. You've got basically a literate culture with a deep self-confidence about its identity and its unity. You've got still all the benefits that China's medieval economic and agricultural revolution had given it. You've got a society in which, for instance, if there's a good idea, everybody can know about it because there's printing. You've got trade networks flowing up the great rivers of China, rivers which carried more shipping actually probably than the whole of the Mediterranean sometimes. So I would think China is still the place in 1350 that's got most things going for it.